This story isn't just about antiques, TV fame, or even a fortune that left a family in shock. This is about a man who spent his life chasing hidden treasures, only to become one himself. Frank Fritz, the bearded, wisecracking, no-nonsense picker from American Pickers, was the guy you wanted on your team if you were digging through a junkyard. He had an eye for value, a gut feeling for what would sell, and a passion for history wrapped in old signs, rusty motorcycles, and rare collectibles. But as much as people loved watching him uncover forgotten gems across America, what they didn't know was just how much he had built behind the scenes. Because when Frank passed away on September 30th, 2024, at the age of 60, he didn't just leave behind a legacy, he left behind millions. And for his family, that was not what they were expecting. But before we talk numbers, let's rewind a little. Frank's health had been on a downward slope for years. His 2022 stroke wasn't just a setback, it was life-changing. He lost mobility, needed constant care, and struggled with recovery. The official cause of death? Late sequela of cerebral infarction. Basically, his body never fully bounced back, and to make things worse, he was also battling aortic stenosis, a condition that made it harder for his heart to pump blood. It was a double hit, and while Frank had fought hard, some battles just aren't winnable. But here's where things take a turn. Even though his last years were tough, Frank's story wasn't just about decline. It was about something far more surprising: redemption. Because if you remember, his fallout with Mike Wolfe had been ugly. These two weren't just co-workers. They had been friends since middle school, bonded by a love of picking and growing up without their dads. But by 2021, that friendship had turned to dust. Frank was not happy about how things had played out on American Pickers. He felt like he was being shoved to the side, turned into a sidekick while Mike took center stage. And when Frank was booted from the show after taking time off for back surgery and rehab, he didn't hold back. He compared the dynamic to Aerosmith. Mike was Steven Tyler, and Frank, just another band member who got left behind. But here's the part no one saw coming. After Frank's stroke in 2022, Mike came back. The tension, the resentment, all the bad blood, it didn't matter anymore. Mike showed up. And by 2023, the two were talking again. And when the end came, Mike was right there. Frank's final moments weren't spent alone in a hospital bed. Mike was by his side, holding his hand, rubbing his chest, whispering words of comfort. He told Frank he loved him. He told him he wasn't mad anymore. And when Frank struggled for breath, Mike gave him one last push. Go find your mom. It was raw. It was real. And for two men who had shared thousands of miles on the road, it was the perfect ending to a story that had taken years to come full circle. But now let's talk about the part that really caught everyone off guard. Frank was never flashy. He wasn't the guy rolling up in a Ferrari or flashing designer watches. He loved old motorcycles, vintage beer signs, and the kind of Americana that made history feel alive. But while he was out there picking, traveling, and making people laugh, he was also building wealth. A lot of wealth. By the time of his passing, Frank's net worth was estimated to be around $6 million. And if you're thinking, wait, wasn't Mike the one making all the money? Well, that's what people thought. But Frank was smart. His money didn't just come from American Pickers. First, he had the show, of course. Over the years, he earned roughly $500,000 per season. And with 22 seasons under his belt, do the math. Even after his exit, those residuals still rolled in. Then there were the books. His American Picker's Guide to Picking 2011 and How to Pick Vintage Motorcycles 2013 were bestsellers. And let's not forget the real moneymaker, his own antique business. See, after he left American Pickers, Frank didn't sit around feeling sorry for himself. He focused on Frank Fritz Finds, his antique shop in Iowa. And let's be real, his name carried weight. Fans still showed up. The store still made money. And he had an entire collection of rare finds that had only gone up in value over the years. By the time of his passing, Frank's personal collection alone was worth millions. And here's the kicker. His family had no idea. When the estate lawyers sat down and started going through Frank's assets, it wasn't just a few old motorcycles and a couple of properties. It was real money. And that's when the emotions started pouring in. Because here's the truth. Frank had always been seen as the rough-around-the-edges guy, the picker who never quite fit the Hollywood mold. But behind the scenes, he had been quietly building a legacy. And now, his family was left with a fortune they never saw coming. The question was, who would get it? Because when someone leaves behind millions, there are always people who suddenly care a lot more than they used to. Frank's passing wasn't just about grief. It was about the weight of his legacy. And that weight, it wasn't evenly shared. Some of Frank's loved ones cried because they missed him. Others, because they realized they had lost their chance to make things right. And then there were the ones crying over something else entirely. The cold, hard fact that $6 million was on the table, and not everyone was guaranteed a piece. But Frank, he wasn't about to let his fortune fall into the wrong hands. Let's rewind to October 23rd, 2023, a full year before his death. Frank's health was already slipping after his 2022 stroke, and he knew things weren't heading in the right direction. So he did what any smart man would do. He locked down his will. He had seen too many stories of estates being fought over, of bitter family members clawing at each other over money, of fortunes vanishing because they weren't properly handled. He wasn't about to let that happen, and this is where Midwest One Bank enters the picture. This wasn't just some random bank handling his finances. It was the institution that had been managing his money ever since he was placed under conservatorship. After his stroke left him unable to make decisions for himself, Midwest One took over. Bills, paid, assets, protected, investments, managed. And when it came time to name an executor for his estate, Frank went with what made sense. Midwest One was already in charge, so why not make it official? But the real mystery? The will itself. Sealed tight, no leaks, no public details. Whatever Frank decided, who got what, how much, and why, was locked away. The only thing people knew for sure was that his estate plans were officially approved on October 18, 2024, just weeks after his passing. Now, let's rewind again. Back to July 2022, when everything changed. Frank was at his Iowa farmhouse when it happened. A massive stroke that sent his world spiraling. Suddenly, the man who had spent his life traveling across America, picking through history, couldn't even take care of himself. And this wasn't just about needing a little help. Frank was in serious trouble. He couldn't make medical decisions. He couldn't manage his own finances. His health was so bad that he couldn't even guarantee he'd have food on the table without someone making sure of it. So his loved ones stepped in. His finances? That went to Midwest One Bank, his day-to-day care. That went to Chris Davis, one of Frank's closest friends. Chris didn't just step in as a friend. He became Frank's legal guardian. He handled doctor's appointments, physical therapy, Crohn's disease treatments, and everything else that came with keeping Frank alive. But then, there was the other issue, Frank's collection. We're talking about a lifetime of picking, all stored away in outbuildings on his property. Rare motorcycles, vintage gas station signs, antique toys, the kind of stuff that serious collectors dream about. And here's the crazy part. Nobody had fully inventoried it. The conservatorship papers listed his collection, but there wasn't a complete record of every item. All people knew was that it was worth millions. And Frank? He had no intention of selling it all off. The plan was to keep the collection mostly intact, using select pieces to stock Frank Fritz Finds, his antique store in Savannah, Illinois. But while his possessions were being taken care of, there was another looming question, his family. Because let's be real, when someone like Frank passes away, people expect a traditional inheritance story. A wife, kids, maybe a few grandkids. But Frank? He didn't have any of that. No wife, no children, no direct heir. So, who did he consider family? This is where things get messy. For years, there were rumors about Frank settling down with Diane, a woman he had dated for a long time. Some people even thought they had gotten married. But the truth? That relationship was dead long before Frank was. And if you don't know the story, Back in 2021, Frank had been planning to marry Diane. He even bought a new house for them, thinking they were building a future together. But while he was on the road filming American Pickers, he found out she had another boyfriend back home. Yeah, let that sink in. Frank was devastated. He later admitted that it crushed his self-esteem, wrecked his world, and sent him down a dark path. And what did he do? He drank. A lot. His drinking had always been an issue, but after that betrayal it got worse. Diane, for her part, denied Frank's version of events. She claimed it wasn't true, that Frank was twisting the story to make himself look better. But by that point, it didn't matter. Their relationship was over, and Frank never looked back. So, when it came time to write his will, Diane's name wasn't anywhere near it. Instead, the real question became, who was? Did Frank leave everything to Chris Davis, the friend who had cared for him when he needed it most? Did his family, who had mostly stayed out of the public eye, get a share of the $6 million? Or, in a last-minute twist, did Frank leave something for Mike Wolfe? Because here's where things get interesting. Mike and Frank had a brutal falling out. They stopped speaking for years. Frank publicly called Mike out, saying he had turned American Pickers into a one-man show. There was no love lost. But in the end, Mike was there. When Frank was dying, Mike was right by his side, holding his hand, rubbing his chest, closing his eyes after his final breath. So could Frank have left something for the man who had been there in the end? We don't know. The will is sealed. But what we do know, Frank's passing didn't just leave behind memories, it left behind a storm. Because when millions are at stake, someone is going to feel like they didn't get what they deserved. Someone is going to contest the estate. Someone is going to claim they were owed more. And with the will sealed, the mystery only grew. The biggest question? Did Mike Wolfe inherit anything? The answer? We may never know. With the will locked away and Midwest One Bank managing the estate, the specifics were shrouded in secrecy. But let's be real. If Frank had left something for Mike, it wouldn't have been about the money. It would have been about what they built together. And what they built? It wasn't small. Frank's empire was tied to his antiques, his store, Frank Fritz Finds, and his personal collection, one of the best in the business. And now, the antique world was buzzing with speculation. Would the collection be sold off? Would the store stay open? Frank's friend Jerry had a strong opinion on this. He believed the best move was an auction, where Frank's treasures could go to the people who truly appreciated them. And honestly, that made perfect sense. Frank had spent his life finding hidden gems, giving forgotten items a second life. What better way to honor him than letting his collection live on with the people who got it? And while the antique world debated the fate of Frank's legacy, his family, both biological and chosen, were dealing with something much heavier. Because here's the truth. This wasn't just about money. Frank's final years weren't easy. His struggles with addiction, his declining health, the stroke that left him unable to care for himself, it all took a toll. And it wasn't cheap. At his peak, Frank's net worth was around $6 million. But by the time he passed, a huge chunk of that had been drained. And if you're wondering how much, try $30,000 a month. Yeah, you heard that right. $30,000 every single month. That's $360,000 a year, just on medical care. And we're not talking about standard doctor's visits. This was full-time, round-the-clock nursing, specialized treatments, physical therapy, and everything else that came with managing a stroke, Crohn's disease, and aortic stenosis. His Iowa farmhouse, once filled with antiques and laughter, had been transformed into a care facility, complete with medical equipment and wheelchair ramps. And let's talk about that farmhouse. Frank had bought it in 2010 for $130,000. A simple two-bedroom, one-bath property sitting on 3/4 of an acre. Nothing flashy, just a real home in LeClaire, Iowa. But by 2024, its value had tripled to $392,727. And right next door, he owned another parcel of land zoned for residential use, an asset that could have been worth even more. But here's the thing. Even with rising property values, it wasn't enough to stop the financial bleeding. By the time Frank passed, His fortune was still there, but not as much of it as people thought. And this is what made his story so powerful. Because Frank Fritz, he was never just about the money. His real legacy, it wasn't in his bank account. It was in the millions of people he inspired, fans who watched American Pickers and felt something. He wasn't a polished TV personality. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just Frank. The guy who could spot a rare motorcycle in a sea of rusted metal. The guy who could turn an old beer sign into a treasure. He made us see value in things we'd normally overlook, whether it was a dusty old gas station pump or a broken neon sign. And more than that, he made us care. He was open about his Crohn's disease, showing fans that you could chase your dreams even when your health tried to slow you down. He fought through addiction, showing that even when you fall, you can get back up. He lost friendships, but he also repaired them, proving that it's never too late to make things right. And even after leaving American Pickers in 2020, Frank never stopped being a picker. His store, Frank Fritz Finds, became a hub for fans, collectors, and antique lovers. It was more than a shop. It was a piece of him. And now, even as his health failed, his store kept his passion alive. That's why the auction idea makes sense. Because Frank's collection, it deserves to go to the right people. Not just anyone with a fat checkbook, but real collectors. The ones who understand the history, the craftsmanship, the stories behind every item. And when those pieces find their new homes, they won't just be antiques. They'll be memories of Frank. Because at the end of the day, Frank Fritz left behind something way bigger than money. He left behind a legacy of passion, a reminder to chase what you love. And even though he's gone, his impact, it's still here. So whether you're a die-hard fan, a casual viewer, or just someone who loves a good underdog story, Frank's journey meant something. He was more than a TV star, more than a collector, more than a man with a fortune people fought over. Frank was one of us, and that's why his story will never be forgotten. If you loved this deep dive into Frank's legacy, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. And before you go, drop a comment below. What's your favorite Frank Fritz moment? Do you think his collection should be auctioned off? Or should his store stay open as a tribute? We want to hear from you. See you in the next video.